Welcome to S&C's podcast series, S&C Critical Insights. In this episode, leaders of S&C's tax practice, including tax co-heads Isaac Wheeler and Davis Wang, along with tax counsel Bella Schapiro and special counsel Aharon Friedman, discuss the background, process, and tax implications of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. There's a lot to unpack as part of the legislation. And whatever you think of the merits of what's in the legislation, it really is impressive politically that the Republicans were able to get the bill through Congress and on the president's desk by July 4th, particularly given the very slim margins in the House that they had to navigate. I think there were a lot of political needles that they needed to thread, and they succeeded in doing so. So we do have a law. It was signed last Friday, July 4th, passed by the House the day prior on July 3rd, and had been passed by the Senate on July 1st. The last week or so was a total whirlwind. So just to go back in time a little bit, in part because we are going to talk about some different iterations of what was in various versions of the bill. The first version of the bill was reported out of the Ways and Means Committee on May 12th. The House then voted up the bill on May 22nd. The first formal reaction we got from the Senate was a bill proposed by the Senate Finance Committee that was released on June 16th. And then on June 28th, which was early morning on Saturday, the Senate Manager's Amendment was released. That was largely what was voted up by the Senate on July 1st. So, Aharon, I'm going to ask you a question on timing and sort of process generally. Was there anything interesting about the timing of this bill, maybe relative to other reconciliation bills? Anything particular to note on process?
Sure. As I think a good comparison is with Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017 or the TCJA. The TCJA was much later in the year. It wasn't signed until December 22nd, 2017. And I think that relates to a lot of the fundamental differences between the TCJA and the OBBBA. The TCJA came off of the 2016 elections when congressional Republicans ran on the Build Back Better agenda in a lot of different policy areas. It was very wonky. There are a lot of details on tax. Congressional Republicans had been working on tax reform for many years. Prior to the 2017 Act, the last big tax reform was in 1986. So it was really a priority. When congressional Republicans came back into power in 2011, following the 2010 midterm elections, tax reform was high up on their agenda. There was some thought that perhaps a compromise with President Obama and Democrats might be possible. The idea being tax reform, so broaden the base, lower the rates, and there's, at least in theory, some bipartisan support for that concept. Ultimately, that wasn't able to happen, but in the meantime, Republicans in Congress put out a 2011 draft on international tax, followed by Chairman Camp's Tax Reform Act of 2014. There's also a lot of work with Senate Democrats, with Chairman Baucus and Senate Finance Committee, Democrat and Republican staffs. There were joint hearings. There was a discussion draft on financial products. There was a discussion draft on small business taxation. Senate Finance put out some discussion drafts as well. There was a lot of discussion and thought into the sort of the nitty-gritty details of how the tax code should be improved, especially on the international side, whereby the US had the highest corporate rates in the OECD at the time, as well as a worldwide system of taxation with deferral, unlike most of our trading partners. Republicans also, generally campaigned on the idea of a tax cut. A tax cut was also very important to President Trump. At one point, he deemed the bill a cut act. Ultimately, that didn't stick. But the 2017 bill ultimately was a combination of tax cuts as well as tax reform. From a procedural perspective or process perspective, Ways and Means Committee started off putting out a draft on November 2nd. I remember I was on committee staff at the time. We had thought about putting out the draft a little bit earlier, but didn't want to put it out on Halloween. But
Very kind.
when you're putting out a
acted right before Christmas. I don't know how that turned out.
But when you're putting out a draft, you don't want to, on a tax bill that's going to move, you don't want to let it stick out there for too long, because it's going to make it a lot harder to move. There are going to be too many people coming in wanting changes. Members are going to have more and more questions and wanting to get things changed. There's a real desire to move things quickly. In 2017, it took about 7 weeks for the whole process to get done, from the beginning of the Ways and Means introduction of the bill until signed into law. This time around, it was about 8 weeks. I think a real difference in the process was, I think in 17, it followed more of respecting congressional traditions with regards to how markups are conducted, how legislation moves. That hasn't always been honored. So in some ways, that was an exception. So for example, the markup stretched over 4 days. The markups went late, but they didn't go continuously through the night. And then after the House passed the bill on November 16th, which was 2 weeks after the House first dropped legislation, the Senate Finance Committee immediately released its own draft. I'm sorry, they released the draft even before that. They released their draft on November 9th, which was the same day the Ways and Means Committee reported or voted to report the bill. Another key difference was that the Senate Finance Committee actually held a markup. They did not hold a markup this time around. Also in 2017, there was a formal conference committee, so the House and the Senate passed separate versions. And there are many different ways of reconciling differences between the two. But in 17, they went through a formal conference committee, which has become increasingly rare in recent decades. This time around, the House passed the bill, and then we just sort of waited for a couple of weeks. So the House, as Isaac mentioned, the House passed the bill on May 22nd. And then there was about a 3.5 week gap before the Senate Finance Committee dropped text. And part of the reason for that gap was that the Senate changes were to some degree pre-negotiated with the House, with the hope being that once the Senate were to pass a bill, the House would just take that up instead of making changes.
So in a sense, the conference was like pushed forward to the Senate's draft.
Yeah.
But because it was behind the scenes and because there were no markups out of Senate Finance Committee, we lack a lot of the legislative history that we might otherwise have as part of a bill. So it's going to be very interesting to see what courts and Treasury and taxpayers do without that backdrop of legislative history that I think there was a pretty robust amount of it as part of TCJA. The dogs that did not bark. So these are provisions that either on the campaign trail or as part of the buildup to the negotiation or in the various versions of the bill itself were either considered and made it in or made it in partially. And the first of those that I'm going to talk about is the SALT cap and the pass-through entity tax. So as part of TCJA, the SALT cap was introduced. It was 10,000 and it was set to expire at the end of this year. And two things were clear about tax reform. One is that the SALT cap in some capacity would be extended. And two, that it would be raised also in some capacity. The first was because it was always going to be a pay for some of the other extenders in TCJA and the legislative agenda. The second, because the House SALT caucus made it clear that they would not vote for a bill that didn't increase the SALT cap. And because of the margins in the House, they had enough leverage within the Republican Party to extract some concessions on SALT.
And many Republicans in marginal seats really campaigned on that promise.
That's right.
This would be raised. So that was a political issue.
Many of them lost their seats in the 2018 elections, partially because of that.
So married with the SALT debate was this debate about pass-through entity taxes, or PTETs. And PTETs refer to the pass-through entity taxes that were adopted by a number of states following the enactment of the SALT cap. And those really proliferated after a 2020 notice that blessed PTETs as being deductible, notwithstanding the SALT cap. So the opening salvo from the House was $40,000 cap that would have lasted for 10 years and then reverted back down to 10,000. And with respect to PTET, the House bill would have disallowed PTET altogether, with the exception of PTET incurred in connection with a qualifying trade or business, cross-referencing the definition under 199 Cap A. So you were good if you were in a so-called good business. You were bad if you were in a bad business. Bad businesses include doctors, dentists, pharmacists, asset managers, lawyers, accountants. Yeah, just the Senate Finance Committee, in their bill, they reduced the cap back down to 10,000 and made it permanent. And they would have treated PTETs as deductible by everybody, but subject to a 50% haircut. The $10,000 cap was really, in my opinion, sort of a reframing of the negotiations. The House SALT Caucus had said that 40,000 was a red line. It couldn't be touched. So it was something of a just stepping all over their red line by releasing bill text with a $10,000 cap that was permanent. I think everybody expected that was just their opening negotiating position. And indeed, the final bill looks a lot closer to the House bill. So the final bill includes a $40,000 cap that will sunset after 2029 and go back down to 10,000. There is no mention of PTET in the final bill, which means that it continues to be deductible as under current law.
I think in that process, you really see the behind the scenes that Aaron, you were talking about, because when the Senate Finance Committee came out with its bill, it was like, who in the Senate is fighting for SALT? No, there aren't Republicans in the Senate that care about SALT. And so, but they had to get it to a version that the House would sign on to. That's what happened during that process.
Yeah, it was basically like, as I said, kind of a placeholder, as opposed to putting something in that was different that theoretically might stick. They put in 10,000 knowing that was definitely not going to stick, so that it was clear that it was only a placeholder.
Yeah, and we had gotten news that by the time that the Senate had released their manager's amendment on June 28th, that the cake had essentially been fully baked with respect to SALT and the House SALT Caucus.
But it's interesting in that process that PTET survived, right? That's sort of the fascinating piece of this history.
Yes, and so it survived, but it survives for now, right? Because this is going to be a topic that is revisited at the latest in 2029, when this would be set to sunset. There's a political necessity to then renegotiate the SALT deal, and as part of that, PTET is certainly going to come up as a topic as well. The other thing to point out about PTET is the notice 2020-75 does contemplate proposed regs that would be issued by Treasury. At least one article has been written suggesting that it's critical that Treasury do so. I personally am skeptical that those proposed regs are high on either taxpayers or the Treasury's sort of priority list. I think the last 5 years, they haven't been in existence and the world has kept spinning. And Treasury has a broad regulatory and deregulatory agenda already, not even taking into account all the regulations that need to be passed in order to make this bill work correctly. So I would be surprised if that leaps to the top of the Treasury's list. Davis, you want to talk carried interest for just a second?
Carried interest is another dog that's still to bark. I don't think that people thought particularly that there was a need to have this in the legislation. On the other hand, on the campaign trail, the president did say that he was inclined to repeal basically the exception that carried interest has enjoyed. So there was always this question, especially when we need revenue, whether carried interest should in fact come back into play. But again, to the surprise of many, not only did it not make it into the legislation, it never touched in any of the iterations of the legislation. It was not in the House bill, it was not in the Senate bill. Maybe it was always dangled as a threat or carrot, one way or another, for the various negotiations that happened. I don't know, Aaron, if you have insight into that.
I think it was one of the things that was on the table and quickly got taken off after input from taxpayers. I think part of the issue is that this was already addressed in TCJA in 2017, so they could have dialed it up a little bit more, but the extra revenue they would have gotten probably would have been limited. On the other hand, I'm going with Senator Wyden's proposal, much bigger, much more arguably radical, arguably retroactive taxation. Constitutional questions have been raised about it. I don't think that would raise a lot more revenue, but I don't think Republicans wanted to go down that road.
So along the lines of things that did not make it into the bill, Davis, can I turn to you to talk about proposed Section 899?
899, yes. 899 was something that I held dear and became very familiar with for about 3 months. I think churlish people referred to it as the revenge tax, which I'm sure was founded on very sound policy rationale. But basically, the tax, if enacted, would allow the US government to impose tax on discriminatory foreign countries. And that would be a tax of up to 20%, I think, in the latest Senate version, based on the statutory rate. And it effectively overrode treaties or would have overridden treaties. And it caused many multinationals to be very incensed and very worried about its impact. Because, to take an example, if a foreign multinational had US operations and they would say, we invest in US jobs and US equipment, but if they were to take interest or dividends out of the US, that would have been subject to this higher retaliatory tax. Similarly, many private equity and hedge fund players thought that this could really deter investment by foreign investors in the US. And I think in the earliest iteration of the House bill, it was not even clear that portfolio interest was going to be exempt from the reach of this revenge tax, which would have meant really that the debt markets for both government and non-government finance would have been seriously disturbed. So the reaction of many taxpayers was, I think, anxiety toward this proposed legislation. The Treasury's response had always been, this is nothing to worry about, because in fact, it was a strategic move to get foreign countries to stop discriminating against US companies. And I think there is some history here that I think is helpful to get into. Going back, I think, at least 10 years and maybe more than that, some countries in the OECD started investigations and impositions of tax that were facially neutral. Some of this was the digital services tax. Sometimes it's called the diverted profits tax. But the object of their taxing policies seemed to be US-based multinationals. And this was an observation that both Democratic and Republican administrations in the US made, that they were really just targeting US companies that were highly successful because European national champions could not compete. On top of that, the Pillar 2 effort involved things called the UTPR, which is really a tax that is not related to the particular profits derived from a country, but just to make sure that the global minimum tax could be collected by someone in the chain of ownership. And again, the fear is that this would target US companies unfairly. So there was actually quite a buildup in the US about the possibility that these taxes toward a global tax system that was facially neutral, but in fact, in practice, could discriminate against US companies. And so Section 899 was really an effort to reverse that, I think, possibility, and to get the other countries to drop these policies. And I think, again, Isaac, to what you were saying earlier, I think it came as a surprise to me that the administration was able to get the deal done in quite the time frame that it took. Right before, I think, the bill went to the Senate markup or non-markup revision, the administration announced deals, and Section 899 was asked to be dropped from the bill, and it was.
Yeah.
And so it turned out to be a big nothing.
And it was really, the sequence of timing was pretty amazing because the Senate manager's amendment was released Saturday morning, really late Friday night. You started to hear rumors that 899 might be dropped altogether beginning Tuesday and a little bit on Wednesday. And there was statements made by Treasury officials. It sounded to me like negotiating bluster. Like, well, if other countries can release proclamations within the next 24 hours, maybe we don't need 899 at all. Sort of like, if you do X, Y, or Z, these tariffs will never hit kind of thing. So I didn't think much of it. And then on Thursday, they announced an agreement with the G7 to exclude from the OECD UTPRs US companies. And it doesn't seem to be contingent on any particular US law being passed. The administration was clear that it should not be something that is a function of US law today. And by Thursday evening, Chairman Smith and Crapo had issued a joint statement saying that they were dropping 899 from the bill. And that was it. So it was really pretty amazing from a turnaround perspective, because I do think, Davis, really every type of client we have was impacted by 899 in some way. We were hearing from asset managers, we were hearing from US multinationals, we were hearing from foreign multinationals. There wasn't a type of client that was fully untouched by 899. So it was very welcome news that it's out of the bill.
Right, that it was out of the bill completely. It was not simply that it would be in the bill, but because the administration would say that these countries are not discriminatory, so it has no impact. It is just out of the bill completely. That's a surprise.
And I think this will be an area that will be very interesting to look at going forward. So Section 899, for example, is just one tool that the administration has to deal with extraterritorial and discriminatory taxes. There are other tax code provisions, most prominently Sections 891 and 896. I thought it was very interesting that in the week before the deal was announced, Deputy Treasury Secretary Falkender had given a presentation to the Council on Foreign Relations and spoke about some progress in the negotiations, but also noting that although Section 899 had started to get a lot of attention, people should think some more about Section 891 and is an existing tool that Treasury has. There are definitely some questions as to exactly how 891 would apply, especially with respect to treaties. The administration also has other trade measures it could take with respect to UTPRs and DSCs. And I think it'll be very interesting to see how the administration's agreement with the G7 will be implemented. There was a very short statement from the G7 basically saying that US law and US companies would basically be outside the scope of Pillar 2. But exactly what that means, I think, remains to be determined. Also, it was an agreement with the G7, whereas there are many countries that are part of OECD's so-called inclusive framework, I think about 150 of them, many of which have already adopted UTPRs. There are also many countries that have adopted DSTs, and the agreement was about Pillar 2 and UTPRs, not about DSTs. There are sort of interesting developments on the DST side. President Trump on Truth went after Canada for refusing to drop its DSTs, which I thought, interestingly, he said came from the EU. And then a couple of days after that, Canada said that it would drop its DSTs. I think some of the European countries have said they're not dropping their DSTs. There's also an EU directive with regard to UTPRs. Once there's an EU directive, all member countries have to follow that. And it's not clear how that directive is going to be changed in order to execute the agreement that the G7 reached. I think will be very complicated politically in Europe. I think from the administration's perspective, although there's still a lot of uncertainty, the agreement at the concessions at the G7 were a very, very big deal. In exchange for that, they gave up, at least for now, Section 899, but they still have a lot of other tax and trade tools left. I think it would be interesting to get into interaction of 891 and treaties.
Davis, how scared should we be of 891? Because it's not like 891 is not new. 891's been there.
Has not been, is not new. It has been there since 1934. And 896 has been there since 1966. And it turned out that if, again, into the history of this, 891 itself was actually enacted because from the US perspective, the French were taking their sweet time in trying to ratify a treaty. So the US felt that US companies were being discriminated against by the French government. They said in 1933, okay, we're going to conclude a treaty to make everything all right. The US was already ready to ratify the deal, but apparently the French government was dilating things, potentially hoping to get more of a concession. At least that is the US view of the history. And in response to that, Congress enacted Section 891. And that apparently lit a fire under whoever was not acting expeditiously. And lo and behold, soon thereafter, a treaty was concluded. So it turns out that, in fact, using domestic legislation as a way to extract foreign concessions has a long history in this country. So I think this administration is just following precedent, if you will, based on what happened. But I think Section 891 is a little bit different textually from the proposed 899. I would make the following observations. One is Section 891 allows you to double the tax under the various sections. There's a question on whether the tax that can be doubled has already been reduced by the treaty to zero. So doubling of zero is zero, right? So that doesn't really mean very much. Having said that, I think there are respected scholars, at least one scholar, and I think there are others who have argued that, in fact, the treaties do not actually override Section 891. So I think that that would be an area of intense intellectual ferment at the very least. But the ambiguity, I think, Aharon, I think you and I have talked about this, gives the administration at least a chance to take a maximalist view of what it can do. And that, again, gives it the negotiating leverage, which is really the true objective, right, in implementing that kind of foreign policy.
Yeah, foreign countries and foreign companies might not want to gamble that Section 891 would ultimately be deemed to not apply to treaties. That's a big gamble.
Yeah,
If rates go up to 80%.
I think some people thought that that's what 899 would be. Like maybe it would be give the secretary broad discretion to just make the good list of countries and the bad list. And then it's really just a leverage tool. But it's interesting that they ended up taking it out entirely rather than keeping it in. And you think it's because it was just too much uncertainty and so many multinationals and American companies were so skittish about how this would impact things very quickly with that level of uncertainty?
Right, or that Section 891 already gives
There's enough with
the executive
to have that leverage.
the ability to introduce that kind of uncertainty to basically create leverage. The other thing I would mention, however, about Section 891 and 896 is that it doesn't have the textual exception, for example, for CFCs or for dual resident nationals that proposed Section 899 had. So I think there's a question if the administration were to use this tool, whether there's also a self-harm aspect to this that's not present in the proposed Section 899. So I think this would be a very interesting area. I'm sure we'll be spending a lot more time thinking about what might happen under something that hasn't been really applied for 90 years.
Thank you for listening to S&C Critical Insights. For more information about our practice, please visit us on the web at www.solcrom.com.